Romans chapter 12, verses 1 through 2. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and to prove what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. One of the most memorable verses, really, from the book of Romans, mainly for just the gravity of the words themselves, but also because they mark an important transition in the book of Romans. From Romans chapter 1 through 11, Paul is talking about the gospel. And as he does in other books, he will spend the first half or more of his book, his letter, talking about the gospel and all of its profundities, all of its glory, all of these majestic things. And then he'll go into exhortations. So 12 through 15 in the book of Romans is all exhortation. Because of what we have in Christ, now go do these things. And so when we look at the book of Romans, chapter 12, we are seeing the transition from gospel theology into its application, into exhortation. And that's another reason why these verses are so memorable. We'll start with this first one. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. The first word, therefore, is an important one, right? The word therefore we know is building on what came before. And the question, of course, is, well, what? Because of what do we do this? And the answer is not merely the end of 11, which ends with this doxology about God's incomprehensible ways, but more than this. It is this plus everything else. It's actually all of 1 through 11. Therefore, because of all of these gospel truths, because all of this amazing truth about how God has saved us now by faith, and I don't have the time right now to go through all of Romans 1 through 11 and tell you about all the wonderful things there, but study it for the rest of your life. But therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy. So, how do I know that this is, Romans 1 through 11 and not just Romans 11? Because the view of God's mercy is what Paul has been talking about for the last 11 chapters. So the first thing we have in this is, therefore, I urge you. So we have what Paul is doing. I'm going to highlight this. This begins his exhortations. Paul is now urging the brothers and sisters, that's the Roman church, right? And really all of the people of God. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy. So therefore, because of the gospel, now we get our exhortation, our instruction. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Now, a question that we could immediately ask is, what do you mean by bodies, Paul? A second question we could immediately ask is, what is a living sacrifice? Don't sacrifices have to die? So, offer first the body. And we really have a question. The question that could be asked here is, one, is it just the physical? Or, two, is it more than the physical? That's our question. And as we keep reading, we'll be able to answer that question. And the second one is, how is a sacrifice living? Let's talk about the living sacrifice first. The idea of a sacrifice, of course, is that it's dead, right? You die, you kill it, you put it on the altar. Christ, obviously, the most incredible sacrifice, in that he sacrificed his life for our sin. But now that death has been dealt with in Jesus, God doesn't need us to die. He actually needs us to live, but in a powerful way. Live each day by picking up our cross and following him. So there is still a death, if you will, but it's a death to self in order that we might live to God. And that's what's being done here. And Paul wants us to do this, again, in view of God's mercy. This happens. If we try to present God with worship or honor or glory apart from his mercy, we're going to inevitably get it wrong. We're probably going to try to earn our status before the Lord. We might feel like we're doing God a favor, but through the gospel, through the mercy of God, the worship of God becomes right and it becomes possible. And now Paul is going to explain, he's going to unpack what this looks like, how to be a living sacrifice. He does it in this next phrase: holy and pleasing to God. And then this parallel statement: this is your true and proper worship. So living as a sacrifice to God, this is true and proper worship. We'll come back to those terms in a little bit. And this phrase right here, it describes the living sacrifice. That the living sacrifice is to be holy, set apart, sinless, righteous, and pleasing to God. It would be impossible to please God apart from these things that we've seen. Let me put them in. I'll just highlight them here. But God's mercy, right, and the offer of our bodies as a living sacrifice, and then holiness, right. All of those things are going to be what makes being a pleasing sacrifice to God possible. If you remove any one of these components, no longer is it pleasing to God. We need really all of these things in order to please God. That's the only way we can rightly come before Him, which is why Paul says here, this, right, this being what? This being a reference to everything we've seen of in view of God's mercy to pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Now, the words true and proper, this is just a kind of more of a minor note, but it's just one Greek word. And the word has this concept of logic to it, of reason. So there's this reasoned, logical aspect of the worship, but there's also this spiritual and emotional aspect to the worship. And this Greek word in particular is the combination of these two things. So in English, it becomes very hard to get both of those ideas into one word because for us, we usually are describing two different things. But what Paul is saying is that our worship should be both reasoned and spiritual. And the words the NIV goes with is true and proper to describe this worship. But if it's not these things, if it's not, a sober view of God's mercy, and yet at the same time a spiritual sacrifice to God, it is not proper worship. Which, by the way, gets us an answer to our other question. Is it just the physical? Obviously not. It is more than the physical, because true and proper worship, by its definition, is spiritual. Okay? So we have this first command. The first command here in this is worship. And to live in worship, not just once, not just Sunday, but to live in worship, right? And that demonstrated through sacrifice, through the death to self and the living to God. That is where, by the way, love is most seen. Then we get this second exhortation. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So there's the command. Do not be conformed to the pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Those two parallel commands, which really say the same thing in many ways. We are not conforming to the pattern of the world. The world certainly has a pattern. Our job is not to conform to it. Now, it's a natural thing to do because that pattern is always around us and it's easy to mold into it. So Paul says, but instead of being conformed, be transformed. And what's great about this, as always, is that it's passive. So do not conform, that's active, but be transformed, that's passive, right? We need what this means is I need God to transform me. God, I need you to transform me. I can't transform myself. Please, God, transform me. And then we could say, how? How does one become transformed? Well, by the renewing of the mind. By the renewing of the mind. That is the means of our transformation. that God changes the way we think about our lives, the way we think about Him, the way we think about the world, the way we think about sin. And when our mind is renewed to be more like God's, well, then we are certainly being transformed evermore into Christ likeness. So this command comes right after live in worship, right? Don't conform, but be transformed, right? And this actually makes good sense of what came before, because we had this really important command, or really important description of our sacrifice, or our living sacrifice earlier, which is that we are to be holy and pleasing. And now I know how I can be holy. How could I possibly be holy? Well, obviously Christ at the cross, but also in this ongoing way, because it's what God's looking for, is this ongoing sacrifice of transformation. I need holiness to be transformed. So my activity, I'm not going to conform to the pattern of this world. I'm going to flee this world. I'm going to go to the God. I'm going to ask Him in His throne of grace to transform me and to renew my mind. And then Paul says, then, so he's building now, okay? Sorry, wrong color. Let me go back to blue. Then, after all this, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, and then His good, pleasing, and perfect will. So this whole section right here just goes to describe God's will. But what he's saying is you will be able, you will have the ability, and let me put this a different way, the possibility of testing and approving what God's will is. Not that you just automatically, what he's not saying, ability and possibility, this is not equal to divination. We don't read tea leaves and discern God's will. We don't just automatically have some kind of subjective feeling and say, oh, I know what God's will is. The process of understanding God's will is a process of discernment. It is a process of testing and approving. To say, I think God might be calling me to this, then to go do it, and then to say, yep, I think that was from the Lord, or no, I don't think that was from Him. That is how we discern what God's will is for our lives. Often we want divination. Often we want to sign, like Gideon, make the fleece dry and the ground wet. But that is not what God is promising here. What Paul is promising, God is promising through Paul, is that we'll be able to test and approve what God's will is when we're living in worship, right? Then, when you live in worship, then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is. Which means that, by the way, if we're not living as sacrifices to God, we have no idea. We have no idea what He wants from us. We have no idea what we're supposed to be doing if we are not living in sacrifice to God. If we are conformed to the world, but not transformed to God, we have no idea what His will for us is. The very first thing and the most important thing you must have if you want to know what God's will for your life is first, you must be living in worship, not conformed, but transformed. Only then will you be able to test and approve what God's will is. And by the way, God's will is always what? Good, pleasing, and perfect. You'll know what is good. You'll know what is pleasing to Him. You will know what is perfect through a process of testing and approving. And the right testing and the right approving can only be done when we are rightly living before God. So that, brothers and sisters, is Romans 12, 1 through 2. Super important text. Beautiful passage, which just takes us really the whole gambit. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to look at God's mercy. I'm going to, because of His mercy, worship Him with my whole life, striving for holiness, putting away the world and seeking after God. Then, and only then, I'm going to be able to test and approve His will and carry that out and know that I am living in a way that is good, pleasing, and perfect before Him. And that is what we want, brothers and sisters. Again, back to the beginning, in view of God's mercy.